Everyone. So, I am Kanishk Malatia and I will be hosting the session for today. Today we have with us our guest speaker, Mr. Arun Kumar Singh. We feel honored to have you here, sir, for this lecture in Cognizance 2021, organized by Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. I welcome you, sir, to this event on behalf of my team and students of IIT Roorkee. To briefly introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Arun Kumar Singh, to our audience. He obtained his master's degree in economics from Delhi University, specializing in econometrics, development policy, macroeconomics, and Indian economic history. In 1979, he joined the Indian Foreign Services, and after completing his education and teaching at university for 2 years, his first assignment abroad was at Embassy of India, Moscow, from 1981 to 1982. Subsequently, he served at Indian Mission in Addis Ababa as Second Secretary from 1982 to 1985. He was involved in India's engagement with Organization of African Unity and UN Economic Commission for Africa. From 2000 to 2005, he served as Joint Secretary, dealing first with United Nations policy and then Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran divisions at Ministry of External Affairs. Before serving as Ambassador of India to United States, Mr. Singh served as Ambassador of India to Israel from 2005 to 2008 and as Ambassador of India to France from 2013 to 2015. Along with his position as a Senior Counselor at Cohen Group, Mr. Singh is a Halle Institute Distinguished Fellow at Ambro University and a Distinguished Non-Resident Senior Fellow at Asia Program, the German Marshall Fund. Throughout his distinguished 37-year career in Indian Foreign Services, he has served during pivotal periods in key global capitals and was instrumental in shaping India's policy as an international power. I know that attendees are eagerly waiting to hear from you, sir. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the mic to our guest speaker today, Mr. Arun Kumar Singh.
Thank you. Thank you. Just want to make sure you can hear me clearly.
Yes, sir, we can hear you clearly.
All right. Thank you. So thank you for inviting me to this interaction. I'm delighted to be here. And I think as has been agreed between us, the session is about an hour. So I'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, and then we can do the question and answer segment. I also thought that in my initial comments, based my own experience in diplomatic assignments in different parts of the world, I will try and outline for you how I see the world changing in the coming 5 to 10 years, because that's the kind of world that all of you will have to engage with. You'll be stepping out of your universities, you're looking for jobs, you'll be looking for opportunities, and therefore it would be important for you to understand what is the ferment that is happening in the world, because things that happened elsewhere do impact on all of us, even if we don't realize it in a very obvious way. If I look at my own career, for example, as was mentioned just now, I joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1979. Between then and now, the world has changed dramatically, several times so. In 1979, for example, the world was defined by a bipolar competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a competition for influence over different parts of the world. It was a competition of ideologies, communism on the one hand, capitalist systems on the other, as to which would prevail. And I recall when I was first assigned to the Soviet Union way back in 1981, at that time, in terms of technologies, things were at a stage that many of you cannot imagine. That when I wanted to speak to my parents, I had to book a trunk call, and the trunk call would be connected 24 hours after I had booked. There were no mobile phones, you didn't have SMS, WhatsApp, or any of these social media mechanisms or video calls to connect. There was no satellite television. There were no fax machines. There were, of course, no computers. So it was a completely different world that we were dealing with. And but in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and it split into 15 countries. And suddenly we were facing a world where US had become the dominant power. It was described not just as a superpower, but as a hyperpower. Some scholars in the West, Francis Fukuyama in the US, declared end of history, that the capitalist system, the liberal system had won, communist system, the socialist philosophy had failed in terms of economic achievement, and this is what has come to stay. That led to a certain kind of arrogance, a hubris in the West, and they started taking unilateral decisions based on their preferences and interests and trying to impose it on the others. For example, the US intervened in Yugoslavia and led to splitting up of Yugoslavia into 5 countries. It intervened in Serbia and tried to hack off Kosovo as an independent country from Serbia. It intervened in Iraq in 2003. It intervened somewhat reluctantly in Libya in 2011. It was conflicted about what to do in Syria, not military intervention in the beginning, but still trying to influence the government there to bring about some change. And we have seen that in all these instances, there has been tremendous instability that has been generated as a result of this. Aside from attempts to intervene militarily based on their own unilateral preferences, the US also led the world into what was called globalization. They felt that the Western economic system had won, and the best way now was to bring the entire world in terms of a closer economic and trade interlinkage with the United States and the West, and push for globalization of production and trade through the World Trade Organization. So that was attempted starting about 1991, 92. In 1995, the World Trade Organization was established. Now, in this process, the US economy, for example, overall benefited. The elite in the US benefited, because today, for example, the top 1% in the United States generates 40% of the income and 40% of the wealth. But the middle class in the US, they felt that they were not benefiting from this process. So the middle 30 to 40% of the population, through this phase of globalization, saw that their wages stagnated because new jobs were being created in other parts of the world, in China, some in India, in Southeast Asia. So their wages stagnated, death rates went up, longevity came down, drug addiction went up. So this segment of the population in the US, in a sense, became alienated from the establishment that was there, the political establishment in Washington, and eventually led to the election of somebody like Donald Trump in 2016, who tried to reject the earlier policies and started speaking of America first, bringing jobs back to the United States. Now, aside from this reaction, many of you would have read that in 2008, there was a major global financial crisis because of the kind of policies and financial policies that were pursued in Western countries, particularly the United States. As a result of that, for some years, there was the Great Recession in the West, including in the US. And during this period, the Chinese economy picked up steam. So, for example, in 2008, the Chinese GDP was about 10% of the US GDP. Today, the Chinese GDP is 2/3 of the US GDP. So China gained in relative economic and technological strength. So that was the second phase that we saw under post-Soviet Union globalization, hyperpower status of the US. But because of some of the flawed policies emerging from the West and some of the blowback that happened on the economic side, China has risen. There is today an economic, technological, military rise of China. And so the world that we are seeing today is once again being defined by what people say is great power rivalry. In 2017, the United States issued a national security strategy document, and they followed up in 2018 with a national defense strategy document, where they said that the priority now for the US was no longer just dealing with the challenge of terrorism, but to deal with great power rivalry. And they defined Russia at one level as one of the great powers that they're in rivalry with, but mainly China. And today, the US sees China as its main economic, technological threat. Of course, Russia is seen as the main military threat at the moment, but China is seen as a growing military threat. The US Secretary of State, for instance, recently said that the main geopolitical challenge for the United States in the 21st century will be the challenge of China. The US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who recently visited India, has said at his confirmation hearing that the bracing challenge for the United States will be the challenge from China. So at the moment, the US is trying to reorganize global relations, political and economic, to enable it to deal more effectively with the challenge from China. Now, we saw that happening to some extent at the time of the Trump administration, because, you know, the way the US-China relationship has evolved and the way it does in the future will have an impact on all of you, the kind of job opportunities that you may have, the kind of mobility that you may be looking for. So the way the US-China relationship has evolved has really waxed and waned. Because till 1971, or actually till 1979, but till 1971, the US did not really have a structured conversation with China. Because after the Second World War, the United States rejected the communist government in China and refused to have a formal diplomatic or official interaction with them. But in 1971, the US reached out to China through a secret visit by then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, to split China from the Soviet Union as part of the global balance of power. And since then, they started building this relationship with China. In 1979, they established diplomatic relations. In 1990, they started working for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And the whole argument in the West was that a deeper engagement with China would lead to political and economic liberalization in China. Therefore, over time, the West shared technology with China, gave them preferential market access, enabled their entry into the WTO, encouraged US companies to invest in China, and that, of course, led to massive buildup of manufacturing capacity and infrastructure construction in China itself. But from about 2005, 2006, the West, especially United States, started feeling that China was now also emerging as a challenge. And that's a challenge that they had to deal with. Initially, the Obama administration, for example, that came into power in 2009, spoke of strategic reassurance to China. That, give China assurance that US will accommodate their rise and will try to find some balance and harmony between US and Chinese political and economic interests. Then they found that that was not working out. Towards the second term of Obama administration, they started talking of a pivot or a rebalance to Asia to bring about more attention, more US resources in the Asian theater to respond to the challenge that they were seeing from China. And China, as it became stronger, for example, today China's GDP is 5 times India's GDP. Its military expenditure is 4 times India's military expenditure. So as China became stronger, it started asserting its unilateral preferences, partly in the global context, but largely in the region surrounding China. So for example, in East China Sea, on Senkaku Islands, where there is a dispute that they have with Japan, they started asserting their rights and harassing Japanese presence there. In South China Sea, they started building military facilities on features, reefs, islands that were disputed between them and Vietnam, between them and Philippines, between them and Indonesia. So because of their large size and enhanced military strength, they started taking unilateral steps on the ground, which started creating challenge for the neighbors. And of course, we saw it partly also in India along the line of actual control last year, when they unilaterally established themselves in certain areas against which we had to take a position, and eventually a disengagement was done. So starting with the economic impact and then what was happening politically with Chinese militarization of the South China Sea features in 2015, President Trump felt that he would be politically helped by taking a very strong, hawkish, anti-China posture, and therefore imposed tariffs against China, took measures to restrict access of Chinese companies to technology in the US, took measures to restrict their accessing the US stock market, and sanctioned several Chinese officials for the actions they were taking in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and other areas. Now, this hawkish posture of the Trump administration appealed to his base, and they felt that this was one way of bringing jobs back to the United States. So when Joe Biden became a candidate for president, partly because of the challenge they saw from China, but also because they wanted to prevent Trump from using China as a lever to gain any kind of political mileage against Joe Biden, also took on very hawkish anti-China positions, very critical of Chinese human rights practices, Chinese actions in East and South China Sea along the line of control with India. And they also said that they would be taking strong action to deal with the Chinese challenge. So I think that's what we are seeing today. The new US administration has basically declared that China is the main challenge they have to deal with. That as sort of in contrast with what President Trump did, they will look at building relationships with allies, partners, to more effectively deal with the challenge from China. And it is in that framework that they're also looking at the relationship with India. You know, I've studied US-India relationship in detail for quite some time, and I have found that historically, 4 factors have impacted on the relationship. And so any point of time, if you try to understand what is the dynamic playing out, if you look at these 4 factors, you can understand the relationship broadly. One is, what is US global priority at any point of time? Second, in the framework of that global priority, what is their relationship with Pakistan? Because then that impacts on India. Third, again, within the framework of that global priority, what is the relationship with China? And then that impacts on India. And finally, what is the strength of the US-India bilateral relationship? So in today's context, they don't have very deep engagement with Pakistan, except in the context of Afghanistan. Because they want to work out a deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan so that they can withdraw the US forces, because US military presence in Afghanistan has been there for more than 20 years. There's deep fatigue in US society and politics against sustaining that effort. They would like to withdraw. It's just that they don't want to withdraw in a way that leads to instability and breakdown of the present structures in Afghanistan, because then they would be criticized for having failed. Or they don't want to withdraw and again create space for terrorist groups to operate from Afghanistan, which could target the US. So that's the dilemma they are facing. So they would like to do some kind of an agreement so that their interests are preserved. And for doing an agreement with the Taliban, for them, Pakistan is relevant. So that's one reason why they continue to invest in building the relationship with Pakistan. As far as China is concerned, today they see China as the main challenge to US interests, economic, technological, and military. And in the framework of that, they see India as a very important partner because they believe that India has the demographic size, the economic capacity, the military strength, acting in its own interest and in terms of its own autonomous strategic decision-making as a natural check in terms of what China may want to do either in Southeast Asia, South Asia, or the Indian Ocean region. So that's one reason they're heavily invested in this relationship. You would have seen that just some days ago, the US president hosted a summit, and the first ever summit, virtual summit, of what is called the Quad countries: United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And this has not been done before. And he said that this was the first multilateral summit that he was hosting as president, partly as a signal of the importance that he attaches to this relationship. And not just symbolic, but out of that meeting, aside from other things, three important decisions emerged. One, that they would together provide 1 billion vaccines to deal with COVID-19 for the Asian and Asia Pacific region. They would be manufactured in India based on funding support from US and Japan, and Australia would assist India in terms of the logistics of distribution. So again, working together, sending a message that together they can bring benefit to the people in the region. And the Indian Prime Minister said that the Quad has now come of age, and also that the India-US relationship is a force for global good. And so that's how it has been projected. The second thing that they agreed on was that they would set up a working mechanism to look at building partnership for technologies to deal with climate change. And third, and I think even more important, that they would set up a group working together to look at new and emerging technologies and global norms related to those technologies. So, one, build partnership to enhance cooperation for new and emerging technology. And what should be the rules and norms governing those technologies? Because the rules and norms governing technologies emerging from China are very different from the kind of rules and norms that democratic societies may want. So that is what came out of the Quad summit. And then just yesterday and day before, the US Secretary of Defense, Mr. Lloyd Austin, General Lloyd Austin, visited India. He had earlier, along with the US Secretary of State, gone to Japan, gone to South Korea, where they held what was called the 2+2 meeting of the foreign and defense ministers of US with Japan and then the US with South Korea. And then the US Secretary of State went back to the United States, but Secretary of Defense Austin came on to India, again to show that they attach importance for the relationship with India, but also because after going back to US, the US Secretary of State went to Alaska, where he, along with the US National Security Advisor, had a meeting with their Chinese counterparts. And they wanted to signal to the Chinese that when we've come to you, we've come not only based on our own strengths, but the enhanced strength of our allies and partners after having coordinated positions with Japan, South Korea, and India. And therefore, what we say has added strength behind it. So that was the signal that they deliberately wanted to give. Now, based on that, if I look at where the India-US bilateral relationship in different areas is and what we can expect in the future, if you look at trade, the US-India trade relationship today is about $150 billion. For India, US is our largest trading partner. Almost 40% of this overall trade is trade and services, in which the digital technology sector plays a very important role. And again, from India's perspective, an important point is that India has an overall trade surplus with the United States. And we are an overall trade deficit country, but we have a trade surplus with the US. That was an important relationship for us. And this trade, $150 billion, has increased 7 times in the last 20 years. So the trajectory is clearly upward. One of the recent things that we started buying from the US, which we didn't do earlier, is energy supplies. Because over the last 3-4 years, we've contracted to buy $8 to $10 billion worth of energy supplies from the US. You may have seen recent reports that United States has overtaken Saudi Arabia as the second largest source of energy for India. Because the US, through shale oil and gas, was able to tap enhanced energy resources within the US. So that's the trade dimension. In terms of investments, over the last 20 years, US companies have invested more than $30 billion in India, creating large number of jobs, of course, locally, but also creating export opportunity. But what is even more interesting is that over the last 10 years or so, Indian companies have invested almost $20 billion in the US, in IT, in pharma, and other sectors, because they have found that through their investments in the US, they get better access, of course, to the US market, but also they're able to better understand technology, management practices, working methods there, which enables them also to supply more from India. So given this, that's another thing that they've looked at. For example, defense cooperation. Till 2008, India had hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. By now, we have already contracted to buy $20 billion worth of defense supplies from the US. And some of them are for platforms that have been very useful to us. For example, the C-17 long-haul cargo aircraft or the C-130 long-haul cargo aircraft enabled us to evacuate people, for example, from Yemen or from Africa when evacuation had to be done, or to provision our forces along our borders or the line of control as was done last year. So they've been useful in that case. We also bought maritime reconnaissance aircraft from the US, which again has been very useful for India. But going beyond just the buyer-seller relationship, we are now looking at technology partnership. So there's ongoing discussion, ongoing effort by the governments on both sides and the businesses to see how technological collaboration in defense can now be initiated on a major scale. So that's something we need to watch. Third dimension that is being looked at is Indian companies becoming part of the global supply chain for US defense manufacturers, because US is among the largest exporters of defense equipment globally. And if Indian companies can start playing a bigger role on that, not only would we build capacity at home, but there would be job creation, more manufacturing done in India, technological enhancement, and of course, we would be able, through that mechanism, also to supply to different countries. So that's something that is now being looked at more seriously. And our Raksha Mantri made a specific mention of that in his press conference with the visiting US Defense Secretary yesterday. So defense is one area. We now do more and more military exercises with the United States. We do military exercises between the armies, navies, air force, tri-services exercises, special forces exercises. These are also increasing in complexity. And in fact, the US has said that they do now more military exercises with India than with bilaterally with India than in any other country outside NATO. So again, a reflection of how this partnership is developing over time. We have recently signed agreements for providing reciprocal logistics support on a case-by-case basis for secrecy of communication between the armed forces, for sharing of geospatial information. So all this will deepen partnership. You may have seen reports in the public domain that when we faced the challenge from China along the line of control last year, the US shared information intelligence with India, gave us provisions, also military equipment, which was found valuable for India. Now, one of the dimensions that contributes to the deepening of the relationship is the diaspora dimension. There is a growing presence of the Indian origin community in the United States. Today, it is estimated to be about 4 million strong. There are more than 100,000 Indian doctors in the US, and I was told that 1 out of 7 patients in the US is today seen by an Indian doctor. Again, the estimates suggest that more than 40% of all hotel rooms in the US are owned and managed by Indian Americans. For a long time, the Indian Americans were focused largely on economic activity, but they have now become more and more active in administration and in politics. You may have seen reports that President Biden has appointed more than 50 Indian Americans to the US administration, to his administration already, many of them in key positions. And of course, the new vice president is partly also of Indian origin. Till 2014, historically, there were only 3 Indian Americans ever elected to US Congress. Since that time, at any point of time, there have been 5 of them simultaneously present in the US Congress. Again, a reflection of the change and trend that is happening. And you see also a growing presence as staffers in the US Congress. So again, an indicator of the future. If I look at the number of students, we have more than 200,000 Indian students, Indian origin. These are not students whose parents are already based in the US. These are students whose parents are in India and they've gone from India to study there. So we have more than 200,000 such students in US universities. And for them, and I think that's perhaps at one level not a good thing, we are spending $6 billion just on their tuition fees. And that's an outflow from India, and there's the other expenditure involved. But having studied in the US, many of them are able to build networks, better understanding of how the US system operates. Some, of course, stay on to work in the US once they get authorization, initially post-university, then the H-1B visa and subsequent steps. But many who come back to India, based on the linkages they have built, based on their understanding of the US system and economy, are able to do work in India and exploit their understanding to build more trade and economic relations between India and the US, and which also, of course, works for them. So given this, how do I see the India-US relationship evolving in the coming period? Today, there is a broad bipartisan support in the US for India. It started in 2000. Till then, our relations were difficult because we had difference of opinion pertaining to the US-Soviet rivalry, pertaining to how the US took an approach related to Jammu and Kashmir in the context of Pakistan. But in 2000, when Bill Clinton came to India, after in 1998, we had done our nuclear tests, then US had imposed sanctions on India. But in 2000, when Bill Clinton came, he started building this whole new relationship with India of deeper engagement. And he was a Democrat. Then Republican George Bush completely transformed the relationship by doing the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement with India. And that was important because till then, India was under nuclear sanctions from the US and led by the US by other Western countries. So technologies that we needed for our nuclear power plants and other high technologies were not available to India. And there were sort of restrictions on India gaining access to those technologies. But once President Bush was able to do Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, an exception was made for India from international rules, norms, and restrictions to allow access to technology related to civil nuclear power plants and other high technologies. And this was unique because it opened up opportunities in other areas, including in defense. As I mentioned, till 2008, we hardly bought defense supplies from the US. Now we have contracted to buy almost $20 billion, and higher levels of technology are being released for India. So, and again, it was unique because in the history of international relations, it is very unusual for an exception to be made just for one country from international rules and norms. And again, interestingly, it was the United States which had started setting up these rules and norms related to nuclear restrictions, essentially targeting in India. And then, of course, they included other countries in those restrictions. And then exception was made for India from the regimes that were set up to target India. So again, a reflection of where the US-India relationship is headed. After that, we had a Democratic president, Barack Obama. He visited India twice in his tenure. No US president had ever done that. He visited India as a chief guest on our Republic Day in 2015. No US president had ever done that, and which is surprising because we are both democracy. Republic Day is the day when we gave to ourselves our constitution. He declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. In 2016, he declared India as a major defense partner to enable higher level technology releases in defense for India at levels that they give to their closest allies and partners. And then when President Trump came, the whole world was, there was a lot of uncertainty how US would pursue its relations with different countries. But with India, the relation continued in a positive trajectory. He declared India as strategic trade authorization level 1. So no, again, highest level technology releases, and he authorized supplies of drones for India, at least in terms of the principle of approval. He visited India in February last year, and he joined the Indian Prime Minister in Houston for a 50,000 strong rally of Indian Americans. So a signal that he was supportive of the India relationship. And now we have a Democratic Joe Biden. And Biden himself, way back in 2001, had written to President Bush asking for sanctions against India to be removed. In an interview in 2006, he had said that his dream was that by 2020, the closest countries in the world should be India and the United States. Now we are in 2021. He is the president. He's in a position to advance that through concrete actions, and many of which he has taken. We spoke about the Quad Summit, the visit of his Defense Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, and he has spoken publicly about support for the India relationship. So I think going ahead, at least in terms of the political support, in terms of convergence of interests, we can expect the India-US relationship to consolidate. But the challenge will be, how do we deal with cooperation in new and emerging technologies? The world we live in is going to change dramatically in the coming period. We already have seen the impact as a result of COVID, but people are talking about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, digital, cyber, biotechnology, and the major advances that are happening in these areas simultaneously, that there is a perfect storm of technology coming. And if that is going to change the world we live, the way we live, the way we work, then the new partnerships that we build between Indian and US companies in the coming period will determine the strength of the economic relationship, and which will provide as a kind of a ballast for the political relationship. In 2015, I made several trips to Silicon Valley to understand the interlinkage that India had with Silicon Valley, including in IT. And I could see for myself that Indian companies, Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin skilled workers were an integral part of the US maintaining its global leadership in innovation and technology, particularly in the IT sector. And therefore, going ahead, if we are able to build similar partnerships in the new and emerging technologies, there'll be a strong foundation for the relationship. So let me stop here, and with the concluding couple of pointers that, one, please be prepared for the fact that the world will change dramatically and several times over as you advance in your career and look for new opportunities at different stages. I would expect that the India-US relationship would continue to consolidate, and therefore there will be more and more opportunity. I would expect that in the coming period, there will be tremendous competition and rivalry between the US and China, and how different countries navigate that will have an impact on technological and business opportunities that you should keep in mind as you define your own policies and preferences. So let me stop here, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that amazing and enlightening lecture. I would like to ask any participant to ask question. Please raise hand and I will unmute whoever likes to ask the question. I see two raised hands.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, my name is Nishant Khokar. Sir, my question is related to economic resources or natural resources. Sir, we know that the Arctic Pole or the North Pole is running out of the ice. The glaciers are retreating. and sir, new lands are emerging out, and there's contain a huge amounts of deposits which are yet to discovered, oil, diamonds, and other things. And sir, any country to grow, the economic resources are very necessary. So sir, in the future, this can create a chaos in between the Russia and America. So sir, how it will affect the our future, like our global future and other relationships, and what can be the India strategy, because sir, India is also need the continuous chain of supply of natural resources to grow its economy. This is my question, sir.
No, thank you. I think this is a very important question. And as you mentioned, there is tremendous focus and competition now happening over the Arctic, because as the ice cap is melting, there's potential for doing economic activity. There's also potential for navigation. And the competition is not just between US and Russia, but China has also entered the fray. And China is trying to do sailings from China through the Arctic to Europe. Which would enhance connectivity for China and bring China directly to Europe, aside from whatever they are doing through the land route through Central Asia. So there is certainly a lot of competition. India has also taken membership as an observer of the Arctic Council, because the actual membership is only limited to those countries that are sort of surrounding the Arctic Ocean, but others come in as observers, and India has taken that. And certainly one of the efforts for India is to enhance its access to resources. And if you just look at conventional energy, India has invested in Russia. It has invested in Latin America. It has also invested in Africa for gaining access. It has used strategic reserves capacity in Europe, in US, to build up some capacity there. Again, the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement that India did with the US allowed India to access uranium in Kazakhstan, in Australia. There is more and more talk of building trusted, secure, resilient supply chains, including for rare earth minerals, where again, India, Australia, US, and others are trying to build partnerships. So yes, what you say is very important. And I can see the different countries, including India, very mindful of that, and are trying to sort of build up their access and options so that that doesn't become a constraining influence.
Yes, any more questions? Please raise hand and I'll unmute you.
Sir, the question is related to this only. Sir, one side we are making a deal with the US on defense level, big deal. But sir, in the major influence on Arctic has Russia. So sir, how this will affect us, sir, in context of natural resources?
Look, all the resources are not concentrated in the Arctic. They have natural resources in different parts of the world. So certainly Arctic is a dimension, and Russia has influence there. China is trying to, as I said, build influence. Many of the European countries have a strong presence in the Arctic. And of course, the US, through Alaska, has access to the Arctic. So different countries have influence. There is going to be a struggle. Russia would be an important player. And we have a strong relationship with Russia. Even though we are building a growing partnership with the US, our relationship with Russia remains strong. We have invested in energy resources in Russia, in Sakhalin. Russian companies have invested in energy in India. And if you just look at defense, almost 60% of our defense inventory is still of Russian origin. And so, yes, I think the effort continues in India to also build a good relationship with Russia, aside from anything else, to prevent Russia from entirely going over to the side of China on India-China issues. And then although Russia and China are doing a lot together, because both of them are under pressure from the US and the West, there is rivalry between Russia and China. Russia is also not comfortable with Chinese growing presence in the Arctic, in Siberia, and other parts of the world. So that rivalry is also playing out, that we have to exploit to the extent we can. Yeah, next question.
I see Kashvi Singh. Unmute
Good
yourself.
afternoon, sir. Sir, could you please give an insight into the work of an IFS officer, and are they able to save some free time? Sir, am I audible?
Arun sir, you're on mute.
Could you repeat your question?
Yes, sir. Sir, could you please give an insight into the work of an IFS officer, and are they able to save some free time?
Of course, no, free time is always there that you can use. But the work of an IFS officer has also evolved tremendously over time. So with the time I spoke to you about initially, if you look at 1980s, where you didn't have satellite television, you didn't have instant communication. People used to use what are called telex machines, which are ancient now. At that time, there was not much direct communication between headquarters of different countries. And most of the communication was done through embassies. So the embassies and the IFS officers were an important channel of communication. And their job, aside from other things and pursuing different areas of bilateral cooperation, was also to be authentic interpreters of the developments in the country where they were based. And then, of course, build relationships, build interactions, get deeper understanding. With today's technology and communication, heads of state and government, ministers are talking to each other all the time. They're communicating with each other on social media. They are tweeting to each other. So the role of the diplomat, the IFS officer, has evolved. That when that direct communication is happening, then you have to build your role of reaching out to other segments of society where the direct communication is not happening. So, for example, when I was in the US, although our leaders would be communicating, they are not going to communicate to parliamentarians in the US. They are not going to communicate directly with governors of regions. They are not going to communicate directly with businesses or think tanks. So there is a segment that then you can focus on to develop better understanding of India in those segments and to get deeper insights into what is happening there and reflect back to your government. And also with today's news media and other things, there's instant relay of information. So the earlier role of providing information, that has been diluted. But although there is a relay of information, as you can see, there's so much misinformation, disinformation also playing out, that you still need someone who becomes an authentic interpreter and validator of information for the interest of his government. So I think the role of an IFS officer when he's posted abroad is to build links, to build deeper insights in society where he's based, to work on pursuing areas of bilateral cooperation, trade, technology, defense, and other areas, and keep his government informed of all that. So even as you do all that, certainly, I mean, there's enough time for people to be able to pursue any other activity that they may be interested in.
Thank you, sir. So there are some questions in the chat box. Like, for example, one of them is the Trump administration were also critical of the privileges that were given to India on international trades because India is seen as a developing country. What will be the stand of Biden administration on this?
So we'll have to watch that. And again, it's a very valid observation. Although Trump had moved the relationship with India positively, he had taken certain actions on trade issues that we were not very happy with. For example, initially targeting China, they imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports also from India, and citing national security grounds. Now, India's argument was that if you say that India is a strategic partner, if you say that the US sees the rise of India to in its own interest, and therefore a rise of India has to be predicated also on economic rise of India, then how do you impose tariffs using national security grounds? The second was that the US had withdrawn GSP benefits from India. And under GSP, India was supplying commodities largely that were made from labor-intensive industries, some in textiles, gems and jewelry, and therefore you are impacting jobs. So that was, again, not justified. But Trump was harsh in terms of tariffs and trade measures because it played well with his base. he had convinced himself that the tariffs in India were high and he needed to take action. India, as I mentioned, has a trade surplus with the US of about $30 billion. And we felt that the India's trade surplus should not get any negative attention because we are an overall trade deficit country. And also, while our trade surplus was $30 billion, China's trade surplus with the US was $360 billion. But when they took a look at the top 10 countries with which US has a trade deficit, India was there among the top 10. So they decided also to focus on India. And on the GSP issue, I was ambassador there at the time of what is now described as the Obama-Biden administration. Several times this issue came up. There were some businesses, some members of Congress who asked for GSP benefits from India to be removed. And we were able to make the argument that, look, as a developing country, as a strategic partner for India, products being made in labor-intensive industry, you should allow these benefits to continue. And the Democratic administration, the Obama-Biden administration, eventually accepted that position and did not remove the GSP benefits. And I think therefore, on those issues, one can expect a more understanding approach from the Biden-Harris administration, but it may be difficult for them in the initial phase to immediately move away from the kind of action that Trump took, because Trump and the Republicans would then criticize them, and some of the business lobby groups would criticize them, and they will need to show that when they did this, there was some gain for the US, including on economy and trade. So we'll have to see how this plays out.
Thank you, sir. I hope, Raj, your question was answered. I would like to request everyone to please post their questions on chat, as there are many questions. So I hope we'll try to take as many as possible, but please post on chat instead of raising your hands. Sir, there is another question. China's concerns over India's active involvement with the Quad countries and the summit recently. How do you expect India and China relationship to turn out in the coming years? Will the hostility continue, or could there be some hope of improvement?
So we'll have to watch. I think different countries, and it's not just India. If you look at India, if you look at Europe, Germany, France, UK, Japan, Australia, every country is trying to build elements of cooperation in their relationship with China. Because they believe that there's some economic advantage to be gained from that, trade-related advantage. There's certain level of technology development happening in China, and different companies want to engage with that process of technology development so that it enhances also business and market opportunity for them. But they're also seeing that based on its new strength, China is taking unilateral and coercive steps and trying to impose its preferences. And so they need to deal with that, and they need to hedge against that. Japan is looking at East China Sea, needs to hedge. Some of the ASEAN countries, Australia is facing its own challenges. The UK, for example, recently came out with what they call an integrated review, which has been projected as a major new document coming from the UK, from post-Brexit UK, to define their role in the new global context. And they have also spoken of an Indo-Pacific tilt to signal that they need to take some new steps to deal with the challenge that is coming from China. So I think from India, the way I see it, from what's coming out in the public domain, the Indian leaders clearly want to pursue cooperation with China, and the disengagement that has happened recently would certainly be helpful. But if China continues to try and impose its unilateral preferences, including along the line of control with India, or pursues the China-Pakistan economic corridor in a way that is clearly a violation of Indian sovereignty, then there are lessons that India needs to absorb as to what extent is China accommodating India's preferences, and to what extent is it trying to be unilaterally coercive. If it is unilateral coercive, then India has to take also hedging action, and therefore the Quad and other areas, India has a India, France, Australia trilateral, because India and France find there's a lot of convergence in their strategic interests, and they're doing more and more together. India buys a lot of defense equipment from France, for example, including the Rafale aircraft. So I think China also has to judge that the kind of what is now being described as wolf warrior diplomacy, very aggressively, assertively trying to push Chinese interests, unmindful of interests of the others. Is that working for them, or is there a blowback happening? And many have argued that the new China or the new face of China that we see is a result of President Xi coming to power in 2012 and defining his role in the Chinese context and China's role in the global and historical context being more assertive, more aggressive. And whether that is sustained or they take lessons from what has happened over the past few years. So this is something that is still evolving, and India will have to, be very nimble-footed to protect its interests.
Thank you, sir. So there's one more question from Sumit. He says that a relation with the Middle East is quite balanced in terms of international relations. We have seen that US administration is taking some active decisions that does not align with the interest of the Middle Eastern countries. And again, China is actively looking to get involved in the Middle East countries through CPEC and other interests, right? So now US supports India openly. So how should we see our relation with the Middle East in the coming future?
So as you know, if you've seen what, for example, has been done over the last several years, India has worked to build its relations with different countries in the Middle East. We've had a strong relationship with Israel for some time. Israel is one of our major defense partners. We've got some critical technologies from them, which were at one stage not available elsewhere. While building a strong relationship with Israel, we've maintained our position on the Palestine issue. So that's one thing we've done. In the last couple of years, India's relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, has strengthened quite a bit, including in terms of energy partnerships, looking at investments by sovereign wealth fund of those countries in India, including in our strategic reserve capacity in energy. We've also attempted to sustain and build a good cooperative relationship with Iran, because Iran is important for India for access to Afghanistan and to Central Asia, if you just look at the geography, because Pakistan does not allow direct transit of Indian goods. And we are also working on the Chabahar port in Iran and developing 2 berths there where India is in the lead, again to enhance connectivity to Afghanistan and Central Asia. So India's effort has been to work with different countries in the Middle East, keeping in mind its own interests. And the challenge is that there are conflicting interests among those countries. So Saudi Arabia and Iran have a very strong rivalry. Iran and Israel have a strong rivalry. And all that has led in the past year to UAE establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. Several other countries in the Middle East, Bahrain establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, Sudan establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, something that was just unthinkable even 2 years ago. So there is ferment and change happening in the Middle East. And of course, India, mindful of all this, has to work to maintain its own interests and enhance those.
Thank you, sir. So there are many questions, but they'll take a lot of time. So we'll just end with 1 or 2 more questions, if with your permission.
Please go ahead.
So, sir, one of the question is that, as you mentioned, that the technocrats hold a vital role in the technological developments in US. So what could be the stand of Indian government to bring in those in India to exploit our resources to make India a tech giant?
Sure, I think that happens in many ways. If you look at the kind of, and people who are now joining the Foreign Service, and I go and speak to the new batches that come in, and if you look at that profiles, very large proportion of people now joining the Foreign Service are people with technical backgrounds. So that's one dimension. Second, the Foreign Ministry does not, or the embassies do not act just on their own or in a vacuum. They act in partnership with other departments of the government of India. And other departments of the government of India, for example, science and technology and others, do have people with technical backgrounds. Then, the government also works in consultation with industry. And there is a dialogue all the time between industry and the government. And that's another way for people with technical backgrounds to impact on the assessment processes and decision making that is happening in the government. So I think these are different ways through which this interaction takes place.
Thank you so much, sir. We are greatly encouraged by your gracious presence, and I hope that everyone here is immensely benefited by your address. On behalf of entire team Cognizance and students of IIT Roorkee, I extend a vote of thanks to Mr. Arun Kumar Singh for gracing the occasion with his presence. I convey my sincere thanks to all the audience members who have joined to attend this event. Sir, I hope there are many aspiring IFS officers here and they are inspired to hear you. Thank you so much for your presence. We hope that we can host you here at IIT Roorkee anytime soon when this COVID situation dies down. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. No, I'm happy to do that. For me, it was also nostalgic. My father had done his MTech from Roorkee several decades ago. So for me, it was, in a sense, a very nostalgic experience. So good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much, sir.